Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Aro Ling Cardiff. This evening, Ngakma Nor'dzin is teaching on the subject of expression, repression, and dissipation.
Thank you. I once heard Vajrayana Buddhism described as transcendental pragmatism, and I thought this was an interesting and apt sort of description, because on the one hand, it talks about our beginningless enlightenment, which is something that some of us are not in touch with. And on the other hand, it talks about pragmatic methods and approaches, things that we can do for ourselves that are really very down to earth, very straightforward. And it's the business of Vajrayana is making a bridge between these two and showing us how through practice we can come more and more to understand realization. We can come to understand what beginningless enlightenment means. And this psychology of transformation is woven into all aspects of Vajrayana Buddhism. It's present throughout. So there are topics here that you will have heard either from us or from anything that you've come across, anything you've read in terms of Vajrayana. So for example, we have the teachings on the color and element symbolism of Vajrayana Buddhism, and this relates our emotions to 5 elements, 5 colors, 5 various aspects of the world around us, of ourselves, 5 various visionary aspects as well. So from within those teachings, we learn about distorted and liberated emotions, that our emotional energies generally are distorted in some way, but that the distorted aspects of those emotions are directly linked to our realization. And this sometimes comes as a surprise to people if they come from a path that sees us as having to get rid of all these dreadful emotions that we have, and instead view them as energy and view them as a valuable resource that we can do something with. We just spent some of today sorting out compost. We've got a wonderful compost barrel that has 2 sections to it, and you fill one and you leave that to rot, and then you start filling the other one. Well, the first one that we filled managed to rot itself down to the point where we had something useful. So we've taken the what looks like scrap and rubbish and things that we certainly didn't want to eat, and we've turned it into something quite powerful that then goes on the plants, on the flowers, well, maybe not on the flowers, so sort of tucked underneath the flowers, and provides something that is of nourishment, something that can then be used.
So many worms.
And so many worms. Wow. I don't know where they all come from, but they're doing a fine job. So we have this also in terms of practice. So from the point of view of Vajrayana, all the stuff that might otherwise be considered scrap and useless and let's get rid of it, is something that we can turn into a useful compost for practice. So won't be going into details on all the associations of colors and elements, because we've had that quite recently, and there are definitely videos available on the subject. But I briefly want to relate back to something that Ngakma Nor'dzin taught recently, which is attraction and aversion and indifference. And we start to get to the nub of these teachings, because what Ngakma Nor'dzin taught was that we have a tendency to relate everything to me. And attraction, aversion, and indifference are a problem because of me. Also you, but because of me. And it means that what we're trying to do is we're trying to fabricate a me that doesn't really exist. And so we look to things that support this fiction, things that undermine this fiction, and things that don't really do anything at all. And we're attracted to that support. We're averse to being undermined, and we really don't care about stuff that doesn't interact with that, the me project, at all. So these three factors then give us expression, repression, and dissipation. They relate to these in terms of the possible actions that we take, or the possible reactions that we have in terms of arising emotions. So attraction, aversion, and indifference relate directly with expression, repression, and dissipation. And these forms are described as the dualistic, deranged ways of dealing with emotion. So then we come back to this duality. The me that we are trying to create and trying to look after is the fundamental factor in our dualistic view of the world, the view that separates self from other, the view that looks to other experiences in life to help support this me project. So once an emotion begins to arise, our usual reactions are going to fall into one of these options: expression, repression, and dissipation. Expression relates to the fire element, and it's an activity that basically shows everyone how we feel about what's going on. It's fairly blunt and obvious. So if we're angry, for example, anger is always a useful one because it's really quite clear in terms of how it acts. We might shout at somebody, it might even come to violence, and it could be triggered by somebody else's behavior in their car, somebody else's behavior with their car, or it could be something that happens at work, a look, could be anything. But if that is our mode of reaction, that's where we'll go. We'll be out there and we will be expressing how we feel. But that expression doesn't need to be tied to anger. It could be tied to sadness as well. It could be almost anything, but it's an approach where how you feel is coming out. Now, what happens when we do this, and especially if we are satisfied that what we've done is what we needed to do, and what we've done fulfills that need. Some people think that to express yourself without any kind of hindrance is getting the emotion out of you, getting it out there. But from the point of view of Buddhist practice, what we're doing is practicing that emotion. And so to go from, I really must hit this person, I've hit this person, I'm very happy that I've hit this person. As you know, this is creating and deepening karmic patterning. So expression of these emotions is not really a good idea. So, okay, if we're not going to express our emotions, maybe we should sit on them instead. So we have repression as a way of governing and controlling that emotion as tightly as possible. And for somebody who doesn't want to hurt others through expressing their emotions, it could even come from a kindly motivation. I'm going to squish this thing, and stop myself from doing things as a result of the way I feel. I will try to deny that I even feel that. I will try and hide it even from myself, so that it never comes out and bothers myself or bothers anybody else. A problem with that is that if we repress strong emotions, we tend to be quite leaky as individuals. And if we try to repress a really strong emotion, whatever kind of face we put on it, it can still be quite visible to others. We can see what somebody is going through, even if they're not telling us. We can't build a wall so well that that's not visible. In fact, if we were able to build a wall that well, the wall itself would be visible, and any attempts at naturalness would not happen. It's another problem is it doesn't address what's set that emotion in motion. We'd rather not have it, so we're pushing it down. It also makes that emotion loom quite large for us, as large, if not larger, as when we're expressing it, because there's a tendency to think if we're expressing emotion, we're getting rid of it, we're flushing it out there. But when we repress it, we're definitely hanging on to it. And it doesn't make it any smaller to hang on to that emotion, even if we're trying to hide it from ourselves, and even if we're trying to hide it from other people. And it can also lead to depression. Oh, I should have said that the acting out, expressing anger, leads to heart diseases, blood pressure, stroke, heart disease, things like that. So it's in terms of our physiology, it's also having an effect. So you have sort of cartoon vision of a really red-faced, angry man, probably fat as well, who's kind of really out there and flushed in the face. And so you have this idea that it's raising the temperature all the time. So it's raising the temperature around that person, but it's also raising the temperature in terms of their own physiology. Repression relates to the water element, and it leads to depression. It also leads to cold diseases, leads to rheumatism, cancer. There's that sense that we're not putting it out there, we're putting it in here, and it's still doing what it's doing. So instead of bothering other people and raising our temperature, we're actually eating away at ourselves and squishing everything down. So if we're not expressing and if we're not repressing, what are we going to be doing? Well, there's another way of dealing with emotions called dissipation. And this relates to the space element. And this is when we engage in another activity that's unrelated to the emotions that we're going through. Punching a pillow, viciously mowing the lawn, going for a run around the block, anything, as long as we're not intellectualizing about what we're doing. So if we're punching a pillow, we're visualizing somebody else that we don't like. This is more towards expression. So it has to be an engagement with that energy, but without engagement with that emotion. So we're really trying to get rid of the emotion, more so than when we're expressing it, because we've taken a sidestep. We're not actually trying to fuel it. We're just trying to not feel that way. And to some extent, that could even happen if we just stop and count to 10 or something like that, because sometimes the flash of emotion is there and gone again, and all we have to do is be able to wait. So dissipation is the least injurious, the least problematic of these three approaches. So it's not going to hurt other people. It's not going to hurt ourselves so much. It might hurt a pillow, or it might get the lawn mown, or we might get fit from running around the block, but it's not directly related to or blaming anybody or applying itself to the apparent causes of that emotional state. So because we're not dealing with the root cause, it will still arise. The problem will arise because we've lost it for now, but we haven't done anything to change our personal situation. And when that thing happens again, the emotion will arise, and triggering one or more of the 5 distorted states. So we've looked at those reactions in terms of fire, water, and space, but you'll be very pleased to know that the other elements also have a part to play in making life more difficult. The air element, blowing around, specializes in anticipation and paranoia, and really, this is very naturalistic. It really whips the fire up. And because it has this anticipatory quality, it's quite capable of going out and finding things that don't even exist yet for you to react to. So there could be that sense of, this person might do something that would cause me to have an angry reaction that I then have to express. So why wait? Why not bring it all forward, and I'll start expressing my angry reaction now to this situation that I've imagined. So this is the role that the air element has to play in the whole emotional setup. And lastly, there's the earth element. And the earth element gives us the solidification of the water element, and that gives us a sense of both strength and brittleness. So the water element is trying to repress the emotion, and the earth element is trying to help to bury it completely. But there it is. It sits there. We've frozen the water, but we've still got all that potential. So all we need is something to come along and defrost it, and out it all comes again. So I think, hopefully, we can all think of examples from our own lives in terms of any of the 5 elements, or a mixture of them, and possibly, depending on our particular modes of being, any of those particular kinds of reactions. So you've got a whole matrix there of possible embarrassing situations that we can remember. So it might be water element and expression, water element in terms of clarity and anger, and out it comes. Or it could be any of that entire spectrum of possibilities. So it's probably worthwhile spending a little time just considering that, because we're not talking theories here. We're talking practical applications of teachings. So if we have for ourselves a reasonable, decent example, and especially if it confirms this idea that expression, repression, and dissipation don't actually help, and we still retain that emotion, it still comes up when we'd rather it didn't, then that's useful knowledge, because we can feel that for ourselves, that we've had these situations. So if expression, repression, and dissipation don't work, I find myself asking, what else is there? Because when I first came across attraction and aversion as being problematic, I thought, wow, we could have indifference as a potential solution to all that. But Buddhism says, no, that's not good enough. And when you come across expression and repression as being problematic, then it could occur that maybe dissipation is a solution. But Buddhism says, no, that's no good either. And Buddhism, as I think I've said before, is a trap, because once you understand the teachings, and once you've had enough time to find those teachings make sense in your own life, there's nothing to do but practice. It really cuts off the escape routes that aren't practice. And we sort of signed up for this. So as much as we'd like to indulge in not practicing and trying to deal with our emotional situations by other means, maybe obliviating completely, that's any of these things are at best a temporary respite if we don't get to the nub of the matter. So this whole question of expression and repression and dissipation all being problems come back to the me project, and also our escape route, a real escape route in terms of liberation, in terms of practice, also hinge on the understanding of the me project, because it's only through understanding that me is empty of existence that we find that we have options that aren't expression, repression, and dissipation, because they all relate to me and my pain in some fashion. They're all saying, I have this painful emotion, I can try this, I can try that, I can try the other thing. Whereas if we start to be suspicious of me and my pain, then we might have some other options. So the question then is, what happens if me doesn't exist? Or what happens, at least, if me isn't central to what's going on? And this also relates back to the centrality of me that Ngakma Nor'dzin talked about in terms of Kilkor, in terms of Mandala. We put ourselves at the middle center of the universe, relate to everything in that way, and cause no end of trouble. So fortunately, Buddhism offers options in terms of what we can do about the me fixation, how we might approach that. And just through understanding, or even being suspicious of the existence of this me, is helpful. Things don't change overnight. There's a lot of momentum behind our habitual thought patterns, all of the things we do. But at least once we start to wonder a little about that, it weakens those particular patterns and those particular ways of working. So we have options. We have many options. We have options, particularly in terms of, if you look at things in terms of Sutra, Tantra, and Dzogchen. In terms of Sutra, we can generate what are called opponent powers. So when we feel anger, we generate loving kindness. Or if we are feeling jealous of somebody else's good fortune, we generate sympathetic joy. So we actually try to engage in another person's good fortune and feel happy for that. There's a potential problem there if we can't manage to be sincere about it, because if we're not sincere in those practices, they can turn into repression quite quickly, and we generate sympathetic joy through gritted teeth, which isn't particularly helpful. So as Flanders and Swan said, always be sincere, whether you mean it or not. So we practice the opponent powers sincerely, and what we're doing there is we're no longer the focus of what's going on. We've placed the focus on what would have been the cause of our anger or the cause of our jealousy or any of those aspects. The focus is now out there. As much as we can manage that, that's what we do. Oh, you've won £1 million, have you? How wonderful. Whatever. You parked across my driveway. How marvelous. And so there's something in there about seeing that from somebody else's point of view, because people aren't anti-you, they're just for themselves. So when they park across your driveway, they're not actually thinking much about what else is going on around them. It's just a convenient place to leave this lump of metal, so they do. So that's just a sense of lack of awareness, but they're not doing it to you. But that's what the Me Project would have us believe. Oh, they do that to me. And you see that a lot on social media, that people aren't talking about what's happening. They aren't talking about the motivation that another person has. They're talking about their interpretation of what's going on, and they're getting really angry about the Welsh government are doing this because, and then they'll state something that they don't like. But what the Welsh government are doing is what the Welsh government are doing. They weren't thinking about you and your particular set of problems at the time. So that's what's happening with the Me Project. So if you can generate loving kindness, sympathetic joy, a sense of generosity, all of those good qualities, which are fairly obvious in terms of the bad quality that we're feeling, you can usually have some idea about how to reverse that. Then that's what we do. So we put the other person or the other thing or what's going on at the center, and send it our best regards, really. So that's an example of, in sutric practice, we become empty of self as a result of generating these opponent powers, because that's the only way that will work properly, is if the self that we normally want to create becomes empty, and then we're free to generate feelings of generosity. Then in terms of tantric practice, we can take our experience of emptiness of ourselves and arise in the empty form of the awareness being of the yidam. We're not dressing up. I'm not taking Ngakma Nor'dzin and putting on the fancy dress of Dorje Trulla or whatever. I have to disappear again. Otherwise, I'm just this actor inside a Dorje Trulla costume or something, and I'm still being angry and horrible in there. Whereas if we dissolve our sense of self into emptiness and re-arise, what we have is the energy of the emotion still doing its thing, but it's not doing its thing on behalf of any me. It's actually the nature of Dorje Trulla or whomever is your most practiced awareness being, and you have a sense of the energy in a much purer form, because it's not trying to do something that it's not made for. It's just simply the energy of the situation. So in terms of Dorje Trulla, you have a sense of clarity and activity and acting for the benefit of the entire situation. And in terms of any of the yidams, you have that sense. So in some ways we may not be at that point, but we have some idea of the qualities of these beings. So even if they're acting as a suggestion or as an example, Yeshe Tsogyal wouldn't act like that sort of thing. Even that is still helpful, even if we can take the view of the awareness being as an example. But as much as we're able to, we disappear and we arise wearing the body of visions. We arise as the awareness being and act from that point of view. So this is a difference between Sutra and Tantra. In Sutra, we've applied opponent powers to our distorted emotional state. So the energy is calmed down, it's not suppressed, but it no longer exists in terms of available energy. But what we've done instead is we've generated kindness towards other people. But with Tantra, all the energy is still there, but it's no longer attempting the impossible task of looking after the mythical me. It's out there and it's of benefit to whoever needs it. So this is the practice of Zablam, or sometimes pronounced Zaplam. So it's a practice of transmutation and transformation. And then in terms of Dzogchen, we have the practice of Tekche, which is the practice of staring into the arising emotion in terms of its physical sensation. And we can then allow the emotion to self-liberate, because the emotion, in terms of what we normally try to do with it, has a sort of energetic and intellectual component. So we have the energy of the emotion, but we are trying to intellectually fabricate something out of that. We're trying to make it do something. Whereas if we are staring into the physical sensation, we are not thinking about anything in terms of that emotion. We're just feeling it wherever it sits and being with it. And it takes a certain amount of courage to do that, because the first thought about I've got this horrible feeling is it's going to get more horrible if we sit and stare at it. But what we find is that without its intellectual component, something completely different. Again, we are back to the energetic aspect of the emotion, and then we have something that liberates itself of itself, but we are free to act with that energy. We still have all of that energy with us. So this is the practice of texture, or cutting through, blasting through. Has all these similes. Thought in this case is seen as scaffolding. And so because we engage in the practice of staring at the physical sensation, the scaffolding of thought falls away, and we have just that energy itself. So these are ways in which we can practice. In a sense, all practices are like this, in one way or other. That all practices are to do with getting me out of the way, and maybe discovering that the me wasn't there in the first place. But these are examples from the viewpoint of Sutra, Tantra, and Dzogchen. In terms of Tantra and Dzogchen, I'd have to say that having a teacher is essential, because they are powerful practices. It's easier to go seriously wrong without guidance. With Sutra, you can rely to some extent on common sense, because we can tell, am I being sincere about what I'm doing? Am I being sincere about my practice? Am I actually happy for this other person's good fortune? We can feel that, we can know if that's happening. But with Tantra, it's possible to generate our imagined awareness being, in the sense of, well, it could be like this, and stomp around being apparently wrathful, whereas actually we're still enacting our anger. And in terms of Dzogchen, because if somebody is a Dzogchenpa, any activity comes from a realized state. This has been misinterpreted, that any activity comes from a realized state. So again, fooling ourselves is possible and dangerous. So having somebody that we can work with who understands us and our energetic patterning, who can say, no, it's not like that, it's like this, can actually keep us on the straight and narrow, as it were, in terms of those practices. So to conclude, what we're talking about here is that Buddhism has a view of us both in terms of our enlightenment and our unenlightenment, and links the two together in terms of practice, in terms of how we can deal with our emotional situation, how we can transform our emotions into their enlightened condition. So it means that enlightenment is always a possibility, and finding a practice that we can engage in and not being afraid of our emotional condition, knowing that if we can practice Dzogchen, it's there. If we can practice Tantra, it's there. If we can't do either of those, there is always Sutra. Because it's fundamental, because it relies on really a basic common sense view of the world, sutric practice is always there. That can include exiting the situation completely. This thing always makes me angry. Well, why do you go there then? You know, so a Mahasiddha might go somewhere where there's a lot of anger and turmoil. If that's overwhelming, you know, if you always get angry when you go down and watch the football, don't go and watch the football. This is the sutric approach. It's perfectly fine. And I think that's one of the things that I really appreciate about Buddhist practice. There are all these possibilities. Some are seen as more powerful, some are seen as faster, but there's always something quite fundamental that anyone can engage with when they need to. So this is expression, repression, dissipation, why we don't do any of those things, and what we can do instead.
Thank you very much.